Blastwave is a 1-pound combat robot I've been working on for over 5 years now. The basic idea of the robot is a 4-wheel drive chassis with a spinning drum that will impact competitors with these extended screws. While the first 2 iterations didn't perform particularly well in battle, I think I finally cracked the code on this design and how to make it competitive at this scale. I'm Caden here with Kepler Electronics, and let me show you what I've learned. The last time I talked about Blastwave on the channel was in 2022 when I built version 3. Just as a review, the major upgrades in this version were better tuned electronics, a lower friction weapon setup, and a more resilient drive system that traded 4 weak motors for 2 stronger motors and a belt drive system. This version looked promising and was supposed to compete in the summer of 2022, but I had car trouble and couldn't make the trip. Due to university coursework and a pair of really awesome robotics internships, I didn't get the chance to compete until fall 2023. I was originally planning on bringing version 3 to this competition, but I noticed several small issues that I wanted to fix. These ended up resulting in a near complete redesign of the bot, which will be referred to as version 4. Blastwave 4 is extremely similar to Blastwave 3, even running the same weapon and drive systems, but it has a few cosmetic differences, namely a slightly longer chassis, smaller wheels, and beefier weapon supports. It's worth noting here that Blastwave 4 was designed in PTC Creo. All previous iterations of Blastwave were designed in Fusion 360, but during 2022 and 2023, I worked full-time as an intern designing robotic parts in Creo, so I now have way more experience there than in Fusion. However, I am on the student version, so this video isn't monetized. Enjoy the ad-free experience. Longtime viewers may remember Blastwave 2, which almost didn't get to compete because of friction. As I was driving to the event, the heat from my car warped the chassis, and while it couldn't tie it into a pretzel, it got pretty close. The assembled version of Blastwave wasn't as bad as these two, but it did press on the weapon system enough to prevent it from spinning up, and I almost didn't pass my functional checks because of this. One of the main goals of V4 was to completely eliminate this failure mode. The weapon axle I selected for version 3 is a shoulder screw, which is a special kind of screw that can more effectively be used as an axle compared to a traditional screw. These screws have 2 separate sections of different diameters. For example, this thicker portion, called the shoulder, is a 1/4 inch, while the threaded portion is 1024, which has a diameter of 0.19 inches. This change in diameter lets me bolt it onto a face and tighten it down all the way, while any rotating implements on the shoulder won't be compressed. However, in a Blastwave scenario where it needs to bridge the gap of these weapon supports, one side would be fixed to the chassis while the other could still move back and forth, potentially impeding spin-up. In V4, my solution to this was to constrain the head of the bolt. I'd attach these small aluminum plates to the face of the weapon support, which would sandwich the head and prevent it from moving, and thus keep the sides of the chassis spaced perfectly apart. These plates would also be tall enough to prevent the drum from touching the ground in the event of the front wheels being removed. The other major issue I had was with losing lids. Over the summer of 2023, before I started working on this upgrade, I started working on my website. On the site is a catalog of all my projects, their parts, their builds, their fights, etc. You should really go check it out. Anyways, I noticed that more than any other problem, Blastwave lost fights because it lost its lids. To solve this, I would no longer be using sheet metal screws tapping into plastic, but I would instead be pressing standoffs into the chassis, which should provide a much stronger attachment for the lids. Talking about the chassis, I would still be printing it out of PLA. While it is an extremely easy filament to print, it tends to fracture and break in a brittle manner. While a lot of builders were switching to TPU around that time in 2023, I was having printer trouble. I had bought a Voxlab Aquila with the intention of using it to print some of these more exotic filaments, but the unit I got was not functional out of the box, and I even got PayPal to refund the purchase since support ghosted me. They even let me keep the printer because Voxlab wouldn't respond to PayPal's inquiries about sending it back, so I decided to fix it since my other printer stopped heating up around the same time. Since the Voxlab was only slightly broken instead of completely broken, I had to try and tune it to work. I spent about 2 months trying to tune it to print even PLA, much less TPU or any more exotic filaments. For this reason, PLA was the only thing I could use. With the chassis assembled, Blastwave was running up against a problem I've seen time and time again: weight. With the heavier motors used in the drivetrain, I had to make some concessions in other areas. The battery was shrunk from this to this. I would also find out just before leaving for the competition that neither of these batteries would have a high enough discharge rating to effectively power the robot. So that's not good. Also, to save weight, the lids had to get way thinner. I had already been having lid problems and decided to compromise them even more. I'm looking at this with the benefit of hindsight, but I don't know why I decided to compete with the robot in this state. There are so many obvious flaws that I knew beforehand and could have fixed if I had just dropped out and gave it more time. I guess I just felt like I needed to after missing the last 2 events I signed up for. However, I did compete. I would take the robot to the Minnesota Monster Mash in late October 2023. My first fight of the day was scheduled against Stompbot, the other bot I had brought, but I forfeited for some reason. Part of the issue with trying to write this script almost a year after the fact is that I can't remember why. Maybe it was to conserve spares, but neither bot should lose anything since Stomp has no weapon. Maybe it was because of drivers? I could have asked any number of people there to drive Stomp, including my dad, who had driven up to watch the event. I really don't know. However, what that did mean is that the first actual fight Blastwave would face would be against Hangry B, a vertical spinner. Let's see how that went.
Are you ready? Blastwave, are you ready? Two, one, fight! Minute 30 remains. One minute remains. Blastwave, do you have motion? I gotta see a little bit more than that. Gonna start a count on 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
This fight was not fun. Blastwave could hardly move when the weapon was on, and then died with no obvious cause, so I'm chalking this failure up to the battery. Predictable failure mode causes predictable failure. Super disappointing showing, all things considered. This fight was actually Blastwave's only one in the tournament. There were some scheduling issues that meant that they had to cut the 4th fight from everybody, and the 3rd match that I was supposed to do, my opponent withdrew. I was out of luck. But was I out of beginner's luck? Isaac and his robot beginner's luck offered to fight Blastwave in a non-ranked whiteboard match, and I agreed. His bot was an undercutter, which I have historically not fared well against, but let's see how that fight went.
Minute 30 remains. One minute remains. I'm gonna need to see some motion. Sorry. Oh, not for me. 40 seconds remain.
Yeah, that's.
That is it.
This fight was a bloodbath, or plastic bath, I guess. This is a perfect example of why you shouldn't use PLA for your combat chassis. While Blastwave wasn't large enough to go home in a bin bag, I did bring it home in a McMaster bag. They completely tore off my weapon, shattered my lids, and even bent some pins on my radio receiver, thankfully not any that I ever use. The aluminum side plates got absolutely bent as well, really curled over. This fight was brutal, and after 2 really frustrating losses, I was ready to retire Blastwave right then and there. But this video still has 15 minutes left, so obviously I didn't retire it. Isaac actually convinced me not to retire the bot in a Discord conversation later about the fight. Combine that motivation with a few ideas about how to solve the issues presented by the bot, and I decided to give it one last shot. Officially, if Blastwave did not impress at its next showing, I would be retiring it with no further chances and moving on to a completely new design. Before we talk about changes, let's talk about what I would be porting over from V4. I really liked the standoffs pressed through the chassis. If I hadn't had to compromise the lids, this would have worked perfectly. Additionally, the weapon system itself worked really well, ignoring the battery issues, and would be brought over with only minor changes to fit the new chassis size. While I didn't manage to get any solid hits with V4, that was more of a function of not being able to drive than anything else. In the box, the weapon was really scary. It was a delivery problem. Now that we've talked about the old features being brought over, let's move on to the major changes. The first and most obvious was the chassis. I would not be using PLA, instead switching over to TPU. This new filament is super flexible and would not shatter like PLA. The Vox Lab actually broke again after this event, and I decided that enough was enough and bought a Prusa. This thing rocks and can print TPU pretty easily. To account for the loss of rigidity due to this new flexible filament, I'd be cutting the lids out of carbon fiber sheet. This should be a bit more rigid than PLA lids with hopefully increased reliability. I had ignored this as an option in the past due to concerns about cost, but recently had heard about CNC Madness, which was supposed to cut carbon fiber plates extremely affordably. I'd be having them cut from 2mm plate, which I picked by gut instinct and then ran the calculations on whether or not I'd have weight later. Furthermore, the entirety of Blastwave 5 would be designed around the battery. I would not be making the same mistake again. This MRCA branded battery, I've been told, is the standard for Antweight batteries. I would be replacing this tiny battery with this battery. Not only would it increase the capacity by 216%, which is evident by the size increase, but it would also increase the discharge rating by 260%. With this battery, I should be able to not only drive for the full 3 minutes without issue, but also be able to spin my weapon and drive at the same time. Here's where things have the potential to get confusing. I actually have 5 slightly different variants of Blastwave 5. I originally had a long section here that explained everything in grueling chronological detail, but I got bored when reading it, so here's the short version. The long version is available on the website if you want that kind of detail. Version 5.0 used 4 small golden gear motors, similar to versions 1 and 2 on the drivetrain, but was redesigned due to reliability concerns with those gearboxes. Version 5.1 used 2 small repeat brushed planetary gear motors mounted at the back of the chassis, with the belt-driven wheels used on V3 and 4. The passive wheels were attached with thread rods into this standoff that spanned the whole width of the chassis. This iteration was redesigned due to rigidity concerns with the back motors and the belt system. Version 5.2 had all wheels independently driven by a repeat brushed gear motor, which necessitated a decently high current controller. The front 2 drive motors could be pushed into the weapon, so they were restrained with this plastic piece bolted to the lid that I'm calling the Halo. This iteration was redesigned due to internal volume and weight concerns. Version 5.3 used the same 4-motor drive system as 5.2, but switched the weapon from belt to direct drive to reclaim internal space and reclaim weight from the weapon system. This version was redesigned due to reliability concerns with the tiny bearings in the weapon motor. Version 5.4 returned to 2 planetary gearboxes in the belt system, this time using the Halo from version 5.2 on the rear motors to prevent them from pivoting and reducing tension on the drive belts. Version 5.4 is actually the version I settled on, so let's go into a bit more detail. The repeat drive brushed motors I selected had stormed onto the scene in the time since I designed Blastwave 3. They feature a planetary gearbox, which are typically much stronger than the spur gearboxes seen in the old 20mm motors, and are also much lighter, coming in at 27.5 grams instead of 44. Taking a look at the halo I mentioned, this is a small 3D printed piece that would encircle the motor and bolt into the extremely rigid carbon fiber lids. This would prevent the motors from twisting as much when belt tension was applied. While the halo would prevent some tension problems, I was concerned about how it would behave with all the flex in the frame. I was informed that timing belts typically require less tension than O-ring belts to transfer torque, which makes sense with the teeth. These new pulleys are just Fingertech snap hubs and Fingertech pulleys attached in CAD with some bore holes extruded through for mounting. These will be printed from PLA Plus because I didn't have time to tune my TPU profile to nail the teeth on the pulley. It took some testing to figure out, but the 45 tooth belt coupled with the 16 tooth pulley meant that I wouldn't need to change any dimensions on the chassis. This was good because I'd already ordered the lids and didn't want to have to get them recut. It is worth noting that I had to modify the pulleys from their original form. The pulleys had a tendency to grip the belt due to printing issues, which caused drive failure when it got caught. I ended up just importing the STL into Blender and widening the track slightly, which resulted in a beautifully consistent drivetrain. With the drivetrain mechanically assembled, I was now able to focus on the electronics. Thankfully, now that I was down to just 2 motors, I was able to use the repeat budget dual speed controller, which is absolutely tiny compared to other dual speed controllers I've used in the past. I was able to pack all the electronics into the chassis, which took some finesse, but that meant I was ready to compete. I still wasn't confident in how it would perform, but I could have competed that next day if I needed to. But I didn't need to. I still had about a week to get everything ready. I decided to take part of that week and finally build a really simple test box so I could practice hitting things and catch some issues before they became bigger issues. These tests were great, both in the sense that I got some good pops on this test bracket, but it also helped me tune the drivetrain. These tests did show off one issue with the belt drive, which is that the groove wasn't deep enough. You can see it here. As I turn quickly, the belt slides back and forth, then eventually off the pulley. While I couldn't solve this issue entirely in the time I had remaining, I did deepen the pulley groove and switch to a shorter belt to try and alleviate the walking issues. Now, while I was solving a lot of these problems, I was getting pretty nervous about Blastwave. I had seen the issues with the weapon belt, and I knew the drive system was really fragile with all the PLA hubs, and I didn't want to burn any more filament on it. So I just decided to let the chips fall as they may and didn't print a spare chassis. I'd convinced myself that I was probably going to retire the bot after this event and move on to something more competitive. And that brings us to the event, SEMO's July Jamboree at the Peoria QuadCon. Regardless of my concerns about the functionality of the robot, I made it to the event and passed safety with no issues, which meant that I was locked in for whatever happened next. I was going to drive super aggressively in every fight. Going in, I only wanted one thing, a couple good hits with the weapon. Anything besides that was extra. Blastwave's first fight of the day was against Womp Womp, a Viper horizontal kit. Let's see how that went.
Countdown to 3, 2, 1, and we're off. Oh, the first hit. I didn't see who made that. All right, we got a stuck spot.
Of course it's doing the thing.
Smack him. Smack him.
Yeah, hit
Hit
it.
him. Oh. You can do it. Oh! Womp Womp's upside down. Blastwave is right side up. No, he's upside down as well. We have no weapon.
Okay, this fight is now a pushing match. Let's speed it up. I managed to get a pretty decent shot early on, but then got propped up on my back. I had known that Blastwave could do the thing and get stuck like that, but I'd ignored it for more pressing issues. Thankfully, they kept hitting me and knocked me down, getting overturned in the process. My belt had come off at this point, so I just kept pinning them and backing off. The drivetrain was really impressive this fight and earned me a win by a judge's decision. Blastwave's second fight of the day was against Waking Nightmare, a Viper lifter kit, so let's see how I fared in that bout.
Up next in the Beetleweigh Arena, on deck, I need Plastic, Phoebe, BB, and Tainted Beef.
Oh, we have
Tainted Beef and Plastic, Phoebe. So guys, just put them in there, keep your power.
At this point. And he's going for a ride. Waking Nightmare just went for a ride and is being pinned up against the wall. We got
Wow, another pushing match. Let's speed this up. Okay, so I got a couple good pops in early on, even managing to flip them over, but eventually the belt would succumb to the same issues and fall off the pulley. I went with my usual strategy of constant pinning, which won me this fight by another judge's decision. I'm not sure what caused it, maybe the heat from just running the bot so hard, but the belt had become super stretchy after this fight. That's really the only damage I encountered. Since I won, I was on to another fight. Blastwave's third fight was against Tiger Light, a Viper vertical kit. Let's see how that went.
one and fight. Okay, Blastwave is the blue one, and Tiger Light is the bigger one.
Who would have guessed? Yet another pushing match. Let's speed it up. Much like the last couple fights, I got a few decent pops at the beginning, but then the belt fell off the pulley and I had to control with pins. Again, I managed to eke out a win by a judge's decision, but this one was extremely close because they managed to get a couple pins too. Blastwave's fourth fight of the day was against Soldier Boy, a modular bot that could run either a vertical or a horizontal setup, and this was by far the scariest bot in the field that day. They ended up running the vert configuration for our match, so let's see how that went.
One, fight.
Okay, so that wasn't a pushing match. That's some good variety for this video. They deserved that win. Normally, I hate tapping out, but I knew I'd just be burning my spares if I didn't. Once they compromised my drive, it was game over, and Blastwave was sent to the losers bracket. Blastwave's first fight in the losers bracket was against Pipsqueak, a horizontal spinner. Whoever won this match would go to the finals and have to fight Soldier Boy again, and whoever lost would get third place. Let's see how that went.
Blastwave, are you ready? This match will start in 3, 2, 1. Fight, robots, fight! Both spares getting up to speed. Blastwave with the drum spinner. Pipsqueak looks like it's got its horizontal spinner jammed in there somewhere.
Pin him.
Stick. Stop the timer.
At this point, they got entangled in my belt and had to be unstuck, so let's just fast forward that.
Now is your last time to get in on the action.
You guys ready?
Yep. All right, gentlemen, are you ready to restart this fight? 3, 2, 1. Fight, robots, fight! As we get back underway from our pre stick, it looks like neither robot has an active weapon anymore. This fight's going to come down to control and who can push each other harder. Fourth drive that we have here on Bruce. Blastwave is going to be a major help, but Pipsqueak has pretty good pushing power as well.
There you go.
I say that, and Blastwave pushed up against the wall. 5, 4. Okay, their pins release, and they're just skirting around the robots here.
Nice.
Got another pin going. And they're just running into each other like a demolition derby, but nothing's happening. We got a pin, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, release. What Pipsqueak's weapon is back to life. This is a major development here, folks. Looks like a little more damage to the drivetrain. Last year just happened. Battlebot coming back to life. May be the deciding factor here. 30 seconds left in this fight. Pipsqueak's now revived weapon is on the belt of Blastwave. And they're just going to say keep going because they've already been unstuck once. They're just going to be basically jockeying for position here. They are very much stuck together. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2.
And the fight went to the judges after we got entangled again. I did manage to get a few good pins, but this pin right here was the turning point. For some reason, they counted a 10 instead of 5 on the pin, which let me pin him for twice as long as any other pin that day. During that pin, Pipsqueak rebooted his transmitter, which rearmed his weapon after it went down during the first entanglement. If I hadn't pinned him then and we had kept pushing each other, I think I would have won that on control, since damage would have been even with both our weapons broken. With that, Blastwave was out of the running. Even though it was out of the competition at this point, Blastwave still ended up placing third. It still feels surreal to even say. I've been working on this bot for 5 years now, since early 2019. I've gone from working on the car ride to Vex Worlds as a junior in high school to still iterating on it as I'm getting ready to graduate from college. I went from absolutely convinced I was going to retire it in a fiery explosion to having an extremely solid performance, even accomplishing my goal of getting a couple solid hits with the weapon. Blastwave might not have roofed anybody, but I did get this flip here which pretty much won me the fight, so I'm going to count that as a success. The question then is, where do I go from here? The drivetrain is super solid. I'm extremely happy with how that turned out. The weapon had some pop, but was plagued with reliability issues due to the belt, and it also kind of was an entanglement hazard, which is not exactly the way I want to win fights. Finally, the internal electronics layout could be a little less crowded. The best part of these problems is I don't think I'll need to do a full redesign to solve them. I won't spoil it here, because doing that would make this video take even longer to make, but rest assured, Blastwave 5.5 will have the potential to take a tournament. Thank you so much for watching. Back in 2019, I would have split this into like 4 separate videos, but at this point, I'm so backlogged that I have like 8 or 9 videos worth of robot to talk about, so I'm gonna have to start combining. Stay tuned for Melon Brawler, my foray into the 3-pound class. That bot has 2 full redesigns and 3 competitions to talk through at this point. Thinking of Blastwave's performance, it's really cool. It's taken a really long time, but I finally managed to make a viable combat robot. If you've been around all this time, thanks for sticking with me. And if this is your first time watching, welcome. No matter which camp you come from, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.